I'm Edwin Ellis, and I'm a professor at the University of Alabama, and I'm the author of the Make Sense Strategies Toolkit. And we're going to be looking at a series of videos that focus on how to use some of these tools when you're teaching the standards for grades 9 through 12 in terms of social studies and history. And so, speaking of standards, basically there are two sets of standards of concern. One are your basic content standards, which is basically knowledge of social studies or history. And the other are the Common Core Language Arts standards that address content literacy standards for history. So we're going to be doing a little bit of both in these three videos. The first one, we're going to be focusing on a range of smart sheets for teaching history, and we're going to look at some samples of how teachers have used them to teach various standards. And then we're going to take a look at what are called vocabulary smart sheets, and these are specifically designed for vocabulary instruction. And of course there is a ton of vocabulary that is addressed when you're teaching history, so these might be of a lot of use to you. And then third, we're going to look at some project-based learning resources on the software that are really excellent devices for engaging students in research and presentations and things of that nature. So in this presentation, we're going to be focusing on primarily just the smart sheets for teaching history and how teachers have used them. To get started, if you think about what it is students have to understand about social studies, there are different kinds of knowledge, and a couple of key ones is simply being able to identify what the main idea or gist and the critical features of a concept are that you're teaching. And of course that might be the main idea, what was significant about it, a famous person or era or policy or issue and so forth, plus the critical features of what's essential to understand in addition to the gist. Likewise, we'd like students to be able to give us examples of the concept and as well as non-examples, what it is and what it's not. Typically, we also are interested in relational understanding in terms of how different concepts hang together or are connected to each other, and factors that affect the concept as well as what the concept affects. Likewise, we often compare concepts as well as understand the concept as a part of a series or a sequence of things. And so in essence, the main idea and critical features, what you're doing is basically defining what the concept is. Examples and non-examples, what we're looking at there are manifestations or applications of the concepts. So for an example, what might be different ways the concept of freedom of speech is manifested in our Constitution, or ways it's applied in the real world and things of that nature. Likewise, these last set all reflect in one degree or another what we call relational understanding, or the relationships between concepts. So if you were to take these different kinds of knowledge, basically main idea and critical features, examples and non-examples can all be structured in terms of hierarchic information structures such as webs. Likewise, relationships in terms of factors that affect and what the concepts affects is cause and effect. Comparison sort of speaks for itself, compare and contrast. And the concept as a part of a series or sequence, that basically is dealing with sequential information. So various graphic organizers that reflect these information structures can be ideal tools for teaching history in terms of these different kinds of knowledge that you're addressing. And so when you think about what it is that the standards really reflect, there's a series of what we call high-frequency social studies topics. And basically, virtually every social studies lesson is highly likely that it's going to be mostly about one of these topics. And so what the graphic organizers in Make Sense are designed to do is really target the essential understandings related to those topics. And so we're going to be taking a look at how those are manifested in some of the standards. So for an example, one of the content standards for history, 9 through 12, is describe American writers' characterization of the 1920s, including Fitzgerald, Lewis, and Ernest Hemingway. So if we were to put that on a graphic organizer in terms of how those writers characterize the 1920s, which would be the best structure? I'm thinking probably hierarchic. And so here's an example of how we might do that. We might use what's called a box frame. And so you have these American authors and their characterization of the 20s and these different authors. And then under that might be how these different authors actually characterized them, what they said, and how they described things in the 20s and so forth. And at the bottom, to bring closure to this, is a prompt in terms of, so what? What's important to understand about this? In other words, why do we care about how they characterize the 1920s? Another example is from the content standards is compare the presidential leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And so obviously with the word compare, that's a compare and contrast. And so here's how I might set that up using a graphic organizer. I might have the three presidents across the top and what their foreign policy was, what their domestic policy features were, and finally what their leadership style was. Now notice with this particular graphic we have information about each, so as we're doing this compare and contrast. In addition, we can draw a conclusion about how presidents addressed foreign policy, domestic, and leadership styles. Here's another one, and describe the impact of social changes and the influence of key figures from World War I through the 20s, including Susan B. Anthony, Margaret Sanger, and Elizabeth Stanton. So if we were to do that on a graphic organizer, I see the word influence, so that sort of signals a cause and effect type relationship. But it could also be hierarchic in terms of what each individual person did. And so one of the ways of setting that up is like this, in terms of each of these three individuals and what they caused or did to change the role of women, change women's roles and rights, and specific details about each. Likewise, we could do a comparison. And so I might set it up with the three individuals here, and then what the goals of each were, what were the major actions they took, and what were the impact of those actions, and then draw a conclusion about that. Personally, I really like this one better than the previous one because it sort of pulls it all together and shows the relationships in a more cohesive way. Okay, now the second high-frequency topic that's often addressed in social studies and history are groups or cultures or organizations. So an example of that would be identify the impact of muckrakers on public opinion during the progressive movement. So if you were to put that on a graphic organizer, which would you select? Identify the impact. Okay, impact is kind of a hint. We're talking cause and effect here. So here's how I might set that up. Now this is a cause and effect smart sheet from the Make Sense toolkit, and it's called Start With and Add This. And so the way it's worked is you have this topic and is about, and so you start with this set of circumstances and the details, you add this to the mix and those details, and then what does that result in, and the details associated with that, with of course the so what at the bottom. So for an example, muckrakers were authors and public speakers who advocated for social change. And so you started with some really unhealthy and unsafe practices, and then we'd list what some of those were. And then we'd add all the bias laws and policies that really discriminated and so forth against people of color and race and so forth. And so that resulted in the muckrakers really getting busy and advocating a number of changes. And so we would identify one of the many of the major things that they did to do that here. So that's how I might set that up. Now we can use these in a variety of different ways. So for an example, if we're reading a passage about the muckrakers, what I can do is actually divide the class into different groups, and I can have one group read the same passage, but they're looking for this kind of information, whereas a different group is just looking for this kind of information. And finally, the third group is looking for this information. So everybody's reading the same stuff, but looking for different kinds of information. And so we give them an opportunity to do that, and then come back later, and then each of the different groups contribute to the class discussion in terms of what they found. At that point, the role of the teacher then is to do some guided note-taking. So if I'm the teacher, I might be modeling really clear and concise notes and with minimal wording in order to capture the essence of the idea. So what we don't want to do is write complete sentences or try to cram paragraphs into these boxes, but rather just the bullet statements that sort of captures the essence of the idea. Likewise, if the students happen to miss something really important, of course, my role would be then to add the additional information they overlooked. Here's another example. Explain Alabama's participation in World War II, including the Tuskegee Airmen. And so that sounds like hierarchic in terms of what they did. Another major high-frequency topic are significant places as well as geography. And so here's an example of a standard that addresses that, like compare short and long-term effects of changing boundaries in the pre- and post-World War I Europe on European nations. And so the topic is dealing with geographical kinds of concepts, but the standard is really addressing a cause and effect kind of structure. Another example, explain Alabama's participation in World War II, including the Aliceville prisoner of war camp, the growth of the Port of Mobile, and Birmingham Steel. Well, that could be a couple of things. It could be cause and effect. For an example, how did the World War II impact Mobile? Likewise, it could be hierarchic in terms of information about what that POW camp was all about, what happened in Mobile, the growth of Birmingham Steel, and that sort of thing. So that could go either way in terms of the structure one would use. Another high-frequency topic, obviously in history, we're all about events. And so one of the standards, explain the entry of the U.S. into World War II and major military campaigns in the European and Pacific theaters. And so we've got, if you analyze this standard and you think about what would be the best way to structure that, you have explain the entry of the U.S. into World War II. Okay, that's kind of like why did U.S. get into it? So that's cause and effect kind of information. But could also be sequence in terms of what are the series of things that happen from beginning to the end of the war, almost like a timeline. So it could also be hierarchical information in terms of taking each, like for example, the European theater and what were the major events that happened there, in the Pacific theater, and so forth. So there might be several different graphics that I might use to address this one standard. Describe the impact of TVA. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps on Alabama and the Southeast. So when you look at impact, that's going to be cause and effect, but it could also be hierarchic because you could take each one of those and break it down into what they were all about in terms of critical information about each and put that on some kind of hierarchical graphic. But primarily that looks like cause and effect. Another major high-frequency topic are processes. So for example, explain how the mobilization of the U.S. for World War I affected the population of the U.S. So it is mobilization is a process that we're addressing, but the kind of structure that we might use to depict it might be sequence. Could also be cause and effect. Another one, explain the transition of the U.S. from an agrarian society to an industrial nation prior to World War I. Okay, so that's a process, as that transition would be a process, but it also would be depicted probably as a sequence of things that happened. Could also be cause and effect or a combination thereof. Another major high-frequency topic, we teach a lot about ideology and beliefs. For an example, describe the Cold War policies and issues, including the domino theory and McCarthyism and their consequence. Well, McCarthyism was an ideology, or all about a set of beliefs. The Cold War, the reason why we have the Cold War, was all about a conflict in various ideologies or beliefs and so forth. The domino theory was also a belief about what might happen and so forth. So there's a lot of ideology in this one standard. This could be basically hierarchical information in terms of explaining those policies or explaining the issues. The domino theory is probably going to be more like a cause and effect type of thing, particularly when you get into discussing consequences. Problems, conflicts, and wars, okay? Describe major events and issues in the Kennedy presidency, including construction of the Berlin Wall, Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so this is all about understanding what were the different problems that Kennedy faced, or conflicts or wars and so forth, and understanding each of those. So since it's mostly about what happened, this could be hierarchical information, but it could also be cause and effect. Could be sequence. in terms of a timeline. Another major area we address a lot in history and social studies are policies, laws, and government structures. So, for an example, describe the impact of the Smith-Hawley Tariff Act on global economy. Well, first of all, understanding what that act was in terms of what are its major components is going to be hierarchical information. But the word impact tells me this is really all about a cause and effect relationship. When they passed that act, then what happened? Explain the impact of American imperialism. Now, right away, you know that this is going to be a cause and effect type of thing. But in addition to knowing the impact, you have to know what the open door policy was in the Roosevelt-Collari and so forth. And so some of these might be hierarchical information in terms of just explaining the various dimensions of the open door policy, and then followed by cause and effect in terms of what was the impact of that policy on things. Now, on the Make Sense Strategies software, there are just a ton of resources here that can help you address standards like these, okay? And so the first area I want to highlight is a category called hierarchic. And so this is part of a set of generic interactive graphic organizers. So remember, these are interactive. You can type on them, you can save them to folders and so forth. You can use them with whiteboard. You can put them up on monitors and so forth. And so organizer smart sheets are generic. They're not designed for anything particular other than depicting these various information structures. You have another set down here that are specifically designed for different areas. And so there's a whole section down here that we'll look at in a little bit that's specifically designed for history. But we're going to start with these generic ones. And so we'll start with hierarchic since that's by far the most common one you can be using. Okay. Anyway, if you click on one main idea, for an example, what will open is this page. And right away you'll see that there's a bunch of little kid ones here because this is K-12 set of resources. But even with one main idea, there can be some resources that you might use. So for an example, I'm going to click on this one main idea frame. It looks like this. And so you have the topic is about, and then what are the key things that topic is about, and so what at the bottom. So for an example, Plessy versus Ferguson court case that is established in that separate but equal doctrine. And so these are the key points about Plessy. And so let's say you're teaching this and you've kind of gone through each of the key points. Now, one of the things you can do to facilitate student engagement is if you notice these places for little bubbles over here, what you can do is have the class either break up in partners or in small groups and have them rank order these in terms of which they thought was the most important or the most impacting. And so they put a number 1 by the one they thought was most important, and then 2, and then 3, and 4, etc. What you get is kids really arguing about this information in terms of what is the most important or most relevant, which of course is getting them to really think about it and engage in it and things of that nature. So you can use these in a variety of ways. That particular technique is called priority share, which is prioritize the ideas and then share what your decisions were with the class. Okay. If we click on two main ideas, then this page opens up. And again, some of these are more little kid oriented and some are definitely can be used in high school. For an example, the two main idea frame is one. And so this illustrates one that addresses the impact of World War II on the Depression. And primarily it focuses on two main things: how it unified society and how economics were boosted when the war kicked in, and what the details associated with that were. Likewise, here's a two main idea graphic. And this one were tactics that labor and management used against each other. For an example, what the labor unions did against management were things like picketing, boycotting, and so forth, whereas management would do things like hire scabs and use lockout techniques and so forth. And so one of the ways you can use a graphic like this, of course, is helping students understand the new information, but you can also use these as assessment tools like on unit tests and things of that nature. For an example, teachers, we often use essay test questions. And so we'll give a question and hope students can compose some kind of reasonable answer for it. However, if you give the question and give the graphic organizer, and if you add some stuff to the graphic organizer to prompt students' thinking to help them organize their ideas, for an example, you can give them a graphic that has this on it, this on it, and this on it, and then they add the details to the graphic organizer and then use that to compose their essay question. What you get is a whole lot better, almost guaranteed, in terms of the quality of information. Now, to tweak that even further, you can do this on your essay question. Have everything but the black ink on the graphic organizer you give kids. So for an example, it includes the word picketing, close shop, boycott, strike on the graphic that you give kids on the test. But you're not telling them what picketing is, and you're not telling them what a closed shop is, etc. But they use this as a basis for composing their essay, and you're able to assess how much they really understand about these topics as opposed to how well they're able to memorize the list of the topics. So it's just a thought. So you can use these both for presenting new information, but you can also use them for assessing what students understand. Here's an example of a two main idea, simple one, for comparing the split of the Republican Party into conservatives and progressives. Here's one on the rise of consumerism. Now this one depicts three main ideas. It's a basic three main idea web. This one illustrates sort of a decompiling of a problem. For an example, why unions felt threatened. And so part of the problem was loss of jobs, part of it was the changing labor market, part of it was outsourcing. And so these are the various significant details associated with each of those. What's really important, though, is don't forget the so what at the bottom, because the bottom line when it comes to teaching social studies and history, if students don't really get the so what, they really totally miss the point of the lesson. And there's really no point in having students learn a bunch of details and facts and so forth if they can't tell you the relevance of what the whole picture is about and why it's important. So this is often the hardest to do, and so very often what teachers will do is they'll do a great job here and they'll ignore the so what. But remember, ultimately the so what is what really matters. Okay, here's an example of famous African-American women that were scientists and so forth, just to give you an example of how you can address different people on these. Here's one that's multiple main ideas on life during the Depression. And so what these are a series of prompts, like for an example, we'll use this as an activity where someone interviews a person who lived during the Depression. Of course, that's getting harder and harder to do, might be. Life during the 60s in this day and age. But anyway, we'll set up these interview question guides, something like this, and then they go interview someone to find out about their oral history of a particular era. I'm going to take a brief look at some cause and effect type graphics. This is a fairly simple one where it's set up, you have this, cause this to happen. And so for an example, Frederick Douglass in his fight for freedom, this highly intelligent and articulate ex-slave began writing and speaking out against slavery, and that caused a lot of people to get actively involved in trying to end slavery. This is a similar, only it's when this happened, then this happened. So for an example, when President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act and the details associated with that, then the Indians were forced to move to the west, and then you have details about the Trail of Tears and so forth. Now let's just take a look at this one, the Spanish-American War. This is a when-then type graphic, cause and effect. The information on this is really good. It's excellent information. The dilemma is that this is all in paragraph form, in complete sentences and so forth, which is fine if you've got a lot of time. But what we need to teach kids is to try not to write in complete sentences and in paragraph form, but rather to record the key information as bullets and to make it as tight and concise and precise as they can. And so while sometimes the paragraphs are helpful to just have the whole thing there, generally this is not the goal and it is actually to be avoided. because what we're really also teaching at the same time we're structuring their understanding using these graphics is we're also teaching them how to condense information, to prioritize it, and take notes and so forth. So good information, maybe not the best use of the graphic. What's most important is try not to cram whole paragraphs into these text boxes because they're really not meant for that, and you'll never have enough room to do that. Here's an example of religion in the 13 colonies, and this is a when, then, so. At this point, you're thinking, man, this guy's just flying through this stuff. There's no way I can keep up. I can't read all these. And I realize that. And the intent right now is not to have you read all of the information that teachers and students noted on these, but rather to just give you a sense of what they do and different applications of them. If you're interested in really slowing this thing down and studying what the students and teachers actually wrote on them, you basically have three options. One is you can pause the video, and that will give you an opportunity to kind of study each of these graphics as they appear, or at least just the ones you're particularly interested in. All of these are also printed in your handout. In addition, all of these are on the software, and you can access these very easily there. So 3 different ways to get to this stuff. Remember, my intent is just to kind of give you a sense of different ways of using these rather than to unpack all the information on each of these. When, then, because on social disobedience. So for example, when you have large numbers of public protesters that are peacefully breaking rules, then social policies are more likely to change because the media gets involved and builds awareness and support for the cause. And so that sort of captures the essence of that process. Social disobedience being an ideology or addressing an ideology. This is another start with, add this, results in graphic that addresses the Brown versus Board. You start with segregated schools, you add this law set to the formula, and what that resulted in was desegregation. Of course, details associated with each. Finally, a couple of examples of comparison. These are here, and first thing I want to point out is that you have different types here, just like you have different numbers of main ideas and so forth. And so if you click on here, you're going to access some Venn diagrams. These are simple matrices, matrix with conclusions and double conclusions. So we'll look at a couple of those. The one I'm getting ready to share with you is Christian beliefs following the Reformation. And if you just look at this graphic, the information on it is actually really pretty good stuff. But man, it's hard to figure out. Just looking at this graphic, there's so much stuff. It's all seemed to be kind of crammed together. And so while VINs are good up to a point, you get beyond that point and the utility of them really begins to break down fairly quickly. And so you might want to consider some other types of comparison tools besides VINs. And so for an example, if you look at this one, where we're comparing liberals with conservatives across these major dimensions, then suddenly it becomes a whole lot clearer in terms of what the information's about and so forth. And it often makes these prompts make it easier for students to know what kind of information they need to be looking for as they're reading about these or discussing them or whatever. Here's one that's comparing indentured servants with slaves. Now, one thing that's pretty important about when you're doing these comparisons, for an example, students often won't know what these subtopics are. And so you can't give them a blank one and expect them to figure out what these major subcategories should be, because they often don't know enough about the topic to know what the subcategories ought to be. So what's important is for you to set it up in terms of what's being compared and then cue them or actually provide what these main ideas are and then let them go find this information as opposed to just giving them a blank. Here's one that compares NATO to the class treaty. This is one this is called a 3x4, which means we're comparing 3 different things across 4 subtopics. And so then and now, the role of the federal government in our economy. So you have before the Great Depression, impact of the Great Depression, and what it's like today in terms of the banking system, Social Security, regulating economy, and so forth. Now this is what's called a square VIN. It's different from this one. in that here we're just making straight comparisons in terms of what's the details for each of these, what's the details for each of these, whereas this one looks at similarities and differences. And so how the progressive movement was different than the civil rights movement and how it was similar. Generally, to be honest with you, I like your simple straight up comparison a lot more than I like the Venns. Just my bias, but some people love the Venn. I like the straight up comparisons. Anyway, so you can see how this works. Now here's one that I really like, and these are making comparisons with conclusions. Way more than I like the Venn type of thing. And so we're comparing two things across 6 dimensions and drawing conclusions about each dimension. And so here's an example. And so one of the standards in the 912 history curriculum is dealing with understanding the impact of imperialism. And so what we're doing here is we're comparing Spain's use of imperialism in terms of their control of Cuba and how critical we were of Spain for being imperialistic, while at the very same time we were using a lot of the same practices in the Philippines. And so we're looking at our imperialism versus Spain's imperialism. And so basically imperialism is all about, first of all, desirable natural resources, and then gaining political advantage over a region, and then historical reasons for wanting a colony, and problems with colonial governments, reasons for rebellions, and then what was the result of the rebellion. And so we're looking at each of these dimensions and controlling Spanish control of Cuba versus U.S. control of the Philippines, and draw conclusions about that. This is a really cool graphic. Okay, this one reflects what are called double conclusions. And so we're making these comparisons, in this case, where the U.S. gets its money. And these are different things we're looking at relative to those comparisons. And then for this, you have some conclusions we're drawing about what each of them are about, conclusions about percentage paid to the government, and so forth. And then we're also drawing conclusions about personal income tax, about corporate income tax, and so forth. This is another example of the double conclusions where we're comparing, this is in economics class, where we're comparing elastic demand with inelastic demand. And in this case, we're looking at different products like a candy bar versus a gallon of milk, fresh strawberries versus potatoes, and so forth. So again, these are double conclusions. This is a double conclusion comparing 9/11 with Pearl Harbor. And finally, sequence. There's a series of different types of sequence graphics that you can access by clicking on any of these topics: steps, cycles, and sequence of events. And so here's an example of one where you have the topic and is about, and then what's the gist of the first step and the details of the step. What's the gist of the second step in details, etc. Here's an example of how that looks. So this was the development of NATO. And what this does is traces a series of events that eventually led to the development of NATO. And for each of these, like the Treaty of Versailles, what that was all about, the League of Nations, what happened there, and so forth. This is also a series of steps. This is the steps to the naturalization process. Sequence also obviously involves cycles. And so these are really good for capturing the essence of what are sometimes difficult to understand processes. So for example, peace resistance, where you have leaders targeting part of a problem, not the whole problem, like voting rights or integration or job discrimination, but not all of these at once. And then they take peaceful actions targeting at getting media attention, like making speeches and getting arrested and then going limp and sit-ins and so forth. That creates negative reaction of those who oppose the change, and it's featured in the media, like all the verbal abuse and the fires and the water cannon and so forth and so on. And then the media gets all into it and is increasing public awareness of the problem, creating worldwide attention, and that builds sympathy for the cause, and it puts pressure on politicians to make change, and then the leaders target some other part of the problem, and around the cycle we go again. So This last section that I want to share with you in terms of these various smart visuals focus on what are called essential understandings. And there's a whole section down here that are specifically designed for these high frequency topics. Now, so far we've just been looking at various applications of these generic graphics. Here, these are specifically designed for specific topics. So for an example, if we click on person, what's going to open up is a series of graphics that are only used for teaching about what's essential to understand about a famous person. So all of these already have prompts embedded to them that are designed to cue students to think about a famous person in various ways that sort of focus their attention on what's essential to understand. So for example, I'm going to click on this clear table. And so what you have in terms of the prompts is who's the person, is important because, ways to describe the person, what were they known for, what are they not known for, don't confuse this person with, what was their impact on the world then and now, what's a contemporary person this individual is like or not like and because, and the knowledge connections this person makes you think of because. So the prompts are already here, so this is no longer a generic one. This is specifically designed for teaching about a famous person. Here's an example of how that looks for Rosa Parks. So for an example, don't confuse Rosa Parks with Harriet Tubman, because she was worked with the Underground Railroad 120 years earlier, and so forth. Okay, now, so we're back on that famous person page, and notice that whenever you have another number there, there's another page of these things. I'm going to collect on this one. It's a semantic person. So this is similar to the other, but slightly different. This person, any famous individual, is always going to be a member of some group of some kind. So this person is a member of this larger group. What are the characteristics of the person? What would be an example of something notable a person did? Don't confuse the person with somebody from today's world the person is like or not like. Explain why the person's remembered and why I would like or not like to be this person. And so here's an example in terms of how that might be applied to Abe Lincoln. Now, group is a different category than person. Of course, famous people are individuals, groups are organizations or groups of people and so forth. And so the page looks similar to person, and some of the visuals look very similar, like the clear table, but the prompts are now focusing on what to understand about the group, not an individual person. So for an example, a simple one is the group known for. And so you have the group, it's an important group because, ways to describe the group, and what are they known for because, and so forth. Here's an example. Muckrakers were a group of people. And then down here we have what the individual muckrakers were known for. Oh, and notice that you can easily import pictures into these to kind of jazz them up. Now let's look at this one. Now this one has prompts that are more specific in terms of what's essential to understand about any famous group. So for example, why some people are in this group or why they join it, action the group sometimes takes, what the group is known for, what was the impact of that group on the world. And here's an example, for an example, prohibitionists. Now this one is on an important place. So we're no longer dealing with a person or a group of people. This is a page that deals with smart visuals that are all have prompts that focus attention on essential understandings of an important place. So for example, since we're dealing with a place, it looks similar to the others we've seen, but the prompts are different. So for an example, important actions that took place and why here? And why those actions were important? What was the impact of those actions then and now? And this place is not known for, don't confuse this place with, and what's it make you think of because. So here's an example of how that might work. So keep in mind that each one of these, when you click on one of these, they'll open up a series of smart visuals that are all designed for helping students really target essential understandings for each of those topics. So if you're studying about a particular policy, if you open that up, all of the smart visuals there have prompts focusing on essential understandings of a policy and so forth. So what we've been doing, just to bring some closure to this, is just looking at a variety of different smart sheets in the Make Sense Strategies toolkit and looking at different ways that they can be used to help you address those social studies standards. What we're going to target next, and this will be a much shorter video, is we're going to take a look at some of the vocabulary smart sheets. Now these are specifically designed for teaching vocabulary. And then a bit later on we'll target project-based learning.